Hello and welcome to Lunchtime BABLing. My name is Shea Brown. I'm the CEO of BABL AI, a company that audits algorithms for bias, ethical risk, and good governance. So today I'm going to be talking about, algorithmic auditing. And a little bit of context, I was just yesterday in a workshop with a bunch of auditors discussing the implementation and the methodologies for auditing the digital requirements of the Digital Services Act. And it got me thinking about this ecosystem and AI auditing and assurance, how it ties into sort of more general responsible AI or good governance of automated systems, and the regulatory landscape, and why BABL even got into this in the first place. And so today I'm going to present on some of my thoughts, and as always, these are biased thoughts from my own personal experience and perspective on what does this ecosystem of algorithmic auditing look like now, and what's it going to look like in the future, what's driving it, where does it bring value, and how it ties into AI governance in general. And so for those of you who are listening, I'm going to share my screen. And as always, if you have questions, please put them into the Q&A, and I can answer them after the presentation. So AI audits and assurance, and here I say critical tools for AI governance. And I really do think that they are critical tools, and I'm going to sort of explain to you why I think that. And so the major goals that I want to get out of this is to raise awareness. So one, raise awareness about AI auditing and its role in upcoming regulations and good governance. So AI auditing does play a role. I'll have to talk a little bit about what that is and what at least my perspective is on this. I'd like to highlight a few active areas to keep an eye on. And when I say active areas, I mean both in terms of regulations that are coming up, but also best practices and the way the industry might be moving. And then I'd like to give some personal perspectives on the emerging ecosystem around AI auditing and how I see it potentially playing out, because there are a lot of actors. There are a lot of potential ways it could go, and I'm going to give you sort of what I think is the most likely. And again, highly biased opinion. So first, before we get started, I'd like to talk about the driving motivations for responsible AI in the first place. And I'll go through this quickly because most people who listen to us and listen to this webinar are already aware of these things, but it can never hurt to review it. And so the question is, what is the landscape of AI risk? And risk is really the key thing that's driving this. And so to the right, I have a number of news articles. There are so many more out there, and it's very obvious that AI or automated systems are propagating harm, and some of it is perceived harm, much of it is real harm, and it's damaging people, it's harming people, it's damaging brands, and it's causing a flurry of regulation now and interest in trying to do something about this. So what is it about AI that is different? Why is it, people have been discriminated against for a long time. People have had opportunities taken away from them for a long time. Why is AI any different? What is different about AI? Well, there are a few things. Well, let me first say that it's not fundamentally different. We still need to protect sort of fundamental rights of people. And that's sort of the baseline that we should all be thinking about when we're working in this field. However, there are some features of AI that make it slightly more difficult or interesting. So one is the scale. How fast, how many people it can affect, right? So a small harm spread over billions of people, you can harm more. The speed at which that can happen is different for AI, and so it's not like you sort of discriminate against someone who's applying for a job in your company. When you automate these processes, this can happen to scale and much, much faster. So speed is important, scale is important. There's a level of inscrutability that is also problematic with AI. So in some sense, Some people don't even know the system is operating, these automated systems. And so in some sense, it can hide harms. Harms get hidden by this sort of infrastructure around these automated systems. There are new attack vectors, which are important. So privacy and safety. There are new ways in which AI can be exploited, or these automated systems can get exploited. And when I use the term AI, I use it very, very loosely. Most of these things are simple. So they're just algorithms. It could be machine learning. It could be some rule-based system, but they are automated systems that make decisions about people. And then in general, when decision procedures are adapted to be automated, that introduce risks that weren't there before. And so there's a fundamental thing that happens when you sort of try to take data about people and conform it to an automated system. You are going to have some filtering effects where some people will get excluded. Sometimes due to technology, sometimes due to something about their identity. Allocation harms, where some people will not get access to certain opportunities because of this automation. Bias is an obvious one that shows up. And so there's a clear reason or motivation for us to worry about this. And so the main motivation for businesses is risk mitigation. So there's ethical risk, safety risk, compliance, liability, reputational, you name it. This is the downside risk to using AI systems. There's also important upsides to engaging with responsible AI. Building trust is the primary one. That's customer trust, like you protect their rights, safety, security, and reliability. Shareholder and investor trust, there's brand trust. And then, of course, it's intrinsically the right thing to do. So where does BABL fit into this? Where do I fit into this? What is our mission? We know that AI and automated decision systems will play a central role in the future global society and economy. I think there's no doubt about that. BABL AI's mission is to ensure that all algorithms are developed, tested, deployed, and governed in ways that prioritize human flourishing. And algorithmic auditing has been that central sort of pillar to this process that we've chosen. But this is our main mission. So let's now get on to the evolving regulatory landscape, namely how AI audit, assurance, and assessment is playing into this. So here, for those who are listening, I'm showing a grid essentially of emerging laws that are coming in. This is just a snapshot of them. There are many, many more. Things like the New York Local Law 144, which has passed and comes into effect in April. I've talked about that ad nauseum on this webinar series. That requires bias audits. The Stop Discrimination by Algorithm Act, that's a Washington, D.C. Proposed law that would require risk and impact assessments. There's laws in California regarding employment and housing. American Data Privacy and Protection Act, that's proposed. Colorado has a law which has been passed, and now they're in the process of the rulemaking, which would require for insurance companies and insurance underwriters using AI and external data sources to test for discrimination. There's certain risk management practices, and potentially audits might be included in the rulemaking. And then probably one of the biggest is the sort of the digital package that the European Union is rolling out, like the Digital Services Act, which would require audits of very large platforms and search engines, and the EU AI Act, which would involve things like risk and impact assessments, conformity assessments, especially for high risk systems. And so there's a lot out there that has this idea of audit or external assessments in it. And here in the US, we have the blueprint for the AI Bill of Rights. And it's currently just a blueprint, but within that, they do emphasize a way of demonstrating safety and effectiveness of a system is independent evaluation. And I have here an excerpt from that on the screen. But it essentially highlights that independent evaluators, such as researchers, journalists, ethics review boards, inspectors, general third-party auditors, should be given access to a system in order to perform the kinds of evaluations that we all know need to happen in order to protect fundamental human interests and rights. So this will eventually be turned into something. It could be an official Bill of Rights, or it may sort of propagate down into individual enforcement agencies. And speaking of those, in the U.S., the Federal Trade Commission has been a really active in this space. And here I'm showing some of their guidelines from 2020, where they sort of outlined some of the problems with using these automated systems and ways in which they are expecting companies to mitigate some of that potential harm. And so things like being transparent, that includes disclosing information about automated tools, adverse action notices, things like this, making them explainable. So if you deny some sort of value to a person, can you give them an explanation about that? If you use risk scores, give some key factors, like explain what factors went into that decision. You need to disclose some algorithmic setting of terms. They need to be fair, empirically sound, so it has to be sort of grounded in some sort of empirical data or reasoning, and it have to be accountable. So this is the governance aspect. And this is not just sort of nice recommendations. The FTC has real power. So an FTC versus Everbom, I'm not pronouncing that correct, but they were able to make them essentially erase their algorithms and erase the data that those algorithms came from. And so here I'm showing from the results of this lawsuit, essentially, that they would make them destroy all face embeddings derived from biometric information that was collected by users that they weren't supposed to, and get rid of. So essentially, it's disengorgement. You have to get rid of the algorithms. And so this is a real thing that they are enforcing. This is not just a nice to have. And in another set of guidelines from the FTC, to stick with the FTC for a second, this is from 2021, and I'll link this presentation so you can see the addresses for where this material is coming from. So as your company develops, this is a quote now, as your company develops and uses AI, think about ways to embrace transparency and independence. For example, by using transparency frameworks and independent standards, by conducting and publishing the results of independent audits, and by opening your data or source code to outside inspection. And so even in within the current remit of regulatory bodies in the US, audits are becoming a topic of conversation and becoming a best practice. So this is moving away from the realm of theoretical, which at the time that BABL was founded in 2018, it was still very much theoretical. It's becoming a reality. And so moving across the Atlantic now to the EU is proposing many initiatives to regulate big tech and to regulate the risks of artificial intelligence. And so the EU AI Act is a critical part of that. And what does it entail? It has a GDPR-like territorial scope. So if you don't know about GDPR, it essentially applies to the data of EU citizens, sort of no matter where they are. And so this requirement essentially stretches across the globe, and you have to be careful. And this is the reason why you have all of these cookie notifications now, and all of these options to opt out, is because of GDPR. And the EU AI Act is aiming to be that kind of standard for AI. There are huge penalties or whole market bans if you violate the EU AI Act. And so this is not a small issue. GDPR had really big fines. EU AI Act will have even bigger fines. They can ban you from the EU market. It's a big deal. And they're using a risk-based approach. So there's high-risk systems like biometrics, critical infrastructure management, education, employment, essential public or private services, including financial services, law enforcement, immigration, justice, and democratic processes. So all of these are considered high-risk systems. And when you have a high-risk system like this, they will require what are called conformity assessments and post-market monitoring. And there's a lot. So a conformity assessment in the EU, I mean, it's a very standard thing, but it's a form of auditing where they're checking your quality management system to make sure that your product and the way you govern your product is up to standards, and it can sort of, you can move your product across the EU based on that. But there are a lot of conversations, and you know, BABL is included in these conversations, that this may not be enough, and there might need to be third-party independent assurance of these sorts of standards beyond just sort of the document checklist that typically goes along with conformity assessment. And so there's a lot of talk of auditing in the AI Act around those obligations. And this is just a diagram. I'll skip this of sort of how a lot of these conformity assessment works. Maybe more importantly now, in terms of its urgency, is the Digital Services Act. And the Digital Services Act has passed. It's in effect. A lot of the obligations and the most important obligations are not in effect yet. So what is the Digital Services Act? It essentially governs, in particular, online platforms and search engines. So places where people upload their media, or social networks, or big search engines like Google, YouTube, TikTok, Twitter, all of these, and smaller ones as well, are going to be governed and have certain requirements under the Digital Services Act. And those requirements are many and varied, and they do get down into specific algorithmic details about how things like recommendation engines need to be monitored, how ads get served and the ways in which they can or cannot get served to members, data protection kind of features, user experience and transparency features. So there's a huge amount. And at the highest level, there are obligations for what are called very large online platforms. So the really biggest ones, the ones I mentioned, and very large online search engines, they will have requirements of third-party independent auditing. So the obligations they have are things like risk assessment and mitigation, mandatory disclosures, user experience requirements. They have to protect fundamental rights. And for these large platforms, those need to be audited. You need to be audited as to whether you conform or you adhere to the Digital Services Act. And so here, auditing is already expressly in this law, and so there's still a lot of debate regarding exactly how this is going to happen. What are the standards for auditing? And so obviously, BABL is really interested in this because this is what we do, and we think that we have a lot to say in this area, and I won't get into it now, but I will talk a little bit about it, sort of what I think are the major differences between algorithmic auditing and standard auditing in a second. Another one which I can't leave out is the Stop Discrimination Act by Algorithms Act in DC. And this one is interesting because it has a very broad scope. And so here I'm showing some quick facts on the screen about it. The scope is very broad. So any automated system really that is limiting or sort of filtering important life opportunities. And so this could include housing, this includes hiring, financial services. A very wide swath of algorithms would be covered under this, and industries. They have some information about which entities would be covered, and that's still up for debate. All of this is currently being debated right now, and there's a lot of interest. I testified in the last hearing for these, and there was a lot of industry there, sort of pleading their case for some of this stuff. So there might be significant changes. And some of the requirements of this, so it's very broad. So a lot of people who are working or operating in DC would fall under this, and they would require impact assessments, notifications, audits, and annual reports that will be sent to the Attorney General. And so this is a one to watch, and it's still in draft, but it's getting pushed back only to Q2 of 2023. And so we'll be hearing a lot more about this soon. Local Law 144. This one is really the pioneer at this point, because it was supposed to come into effect January 1st. It's now been pushed back to I have the date wrong actually on the slide. It's been pushed back to April 15th. And this is one that requires a bias audit of automated employment decision tools. So tools you might use to make hiring or promotion decisions. And I think there are going to be a lot of eyes on this, as there should be, for all of these other these acts and laws and regulations that I've talked about. I think that it makes a lot of sense to pay close attention to what happens with New York and how this rolls out, because this is a case that's requiring these audits. They are requiring them to be independent audits, so you can't just do self-assessments. And so it's really going to push the idea of what is this ecosystem able to handle? What is the backlash when audit reports start becoming public? That sort of thing. And so I've talked about this a lot, and we're very active in this space. And so this is something to watch. And so speaking of that ecosystem, what is the ecosystem? I mean, I've been talking, you've seen all of these laws now and agencies and proposed laws and bills talking about algorithmic auditing. But what is it, and is there an ecosystem to support it? What are the different ways that they can be done? And there is an ecosystem growing. And here I've lifted this from, and I should have had the link from, I'm forgetting the name of the website, but I'll definitely put that link when we post it on YouTube. So this shows a bunch of logos here. And let me just pause for a second and talk about the various players in this ecosystem. Not necessarily specifically, but clearly companies are going to need to get their algorithmic systems audited in some way, right? And it could be, in some cases, the requirements are very internal, meaning you have to be auditing internally and monitoring the behavior of your system. And in those cases, there are a number of companies that are offering sort of software as a service tooling that will allow companies to do this sort of governance and do this sort of monitoring. And so some of them are more focused on the machine learning monitoring side of things. So companies like Fiddler, for instance, they're not on this list here. Truera has that as well. All of them do, in fact, but there's Mission Control. Credo AI is a really big one that's coming up now. But on the end of the ones like people like Credo, they also there's a greater focus on AI governance and this ability to monitor and track potentially for compliance. And so it's hard to tell where these systems. Fairly AI is another one. It's hard to tell exactly where this is going to end up, at what end of the spectrum, but it does make a lot of sense that companies need to have appropriate tooling where they can sort of integrate both the data science monitoring of things like bias, things like accuracy, concept drift, all of these explainability techniques. And some of them are more or less have all of these features. Inventory, said.ai has an inventory tool, and there's a huge market here for these, right? I wouldn't say huge in the sense like that it's really hit its stride. I think it's going to become much, much bigger as we see these things like the EU AI Act and the Digital Services Act and other regulations really starting to get enforced. I think you're going to see a huge explosion in this industry of these platforms, and so these are critical tools for doing that. On the other side, or sort of complementary to that, are the audits. So these tools are being used by the organizations to monitor their systems and do other things. In some sense, and depending on the regulation, they can't themselves be the auditors. And so there is a niche, and this is the niche that BABL fits into, is that of independent auditors. So the people who are willing to come in and do this sort of assurance or audit to check against some sort of standards or guidelines or requirements of a law. And there are a number of players in this space as well. It's not just BABL. Etiquette is a great company out of Spain, but also moving to the US. Orca, this is Kathy O'Neill's company, very active in this space. B&H.ai, they do really great work. They are a law firm, but that does this sort of auditing and assessments, and also consulting. Cantelis Group, I'm not sure if they do auditing, but I definitely they're highly regarded in terms of their advisory. And so there's a whole ecosystem of these players that are emerging. But you can't forget that there is the Big Four and other standard auditing firms out there. And so auditing has had a very long history. Financial auditing and regulatory assurance has been around also for a long time. And so the question is, how does that play into this emerging ecosystem? And so here I'm highlighting some of the work that we've done in terms of publishing papers, really trying to dig into exactly what should these audits look like. And so, we are very empirically based, very research based, and we try to gather data. We try to look at case studies, try to figure out what is going to be the most effective thing. What should audits look like? What do you need to have there? So the way in which we approach this are two ways. And a lot of you know this. One is directly auditing a system. And so what that means is we are, in some sense, the subject matter experts at the same time as being the ones who are doing the verification. And so this is going in and, let's say, testing a system for bias, doing an ethical risk assessment, examining the governance within an organization. This is a very hands-on process, very expensive process. But that is something that we've done for a long time. But now that this requirement for auditing seems like it's going to be exploding, there is another method, which is essentially it's like an attestation engagement, where essentially the companies will do all the testing based on some standard. So there has to be a standard here. And one of the major players, which I didn't mention in this ecosystem, are standards bodies and organizations which are going to come up with those standards. And ForHumanity is one that I'm personally involved with on a personal level, where I contribute to their standards. And they are hyper-focused on this one issue of algorithmic auditing, and how do you come up with criteria that will be sort of the go-to source of truth for the subject matter, in this case, things like risk assessments and bias assessments. So an attestation engagement is one where, and this happens in regulatory assurance and audit for a long time, is where the companies are the ones that are doing all of the work, and they are making statements. They produce documentation, produce evidence, and they're making statements that they have complied with some standard. And what the job of the independent auditor is that we do the evaluation. So we evaluate against criteria. We review that documentation against criteria. We do a claims verification process, and then we submit an opinion. This is and when we do this, we of course can't do any advisory services. We can't really prescribe corrective actions or do any of the direct testing ourselves. This is really just an assurance / audit engagement. And in order to do this, you have to have kind of really clear criteria that are sort of unambiguous. It's binary. You know exactly what it is that these companies need to do in order to be compliant, and for you to sort of pass have reasonable assurance that they meet this standard. And so there's a bunch of normative standards that we use and that all sort of companies use. And so I mentioned the Big Four. There's both US and international standards for these sorts of engagements, and we rely a lot on ForHumanity as well. But what is the difference here between standard? Because what I'm describing here sounds very much like just an ordinary audit that you might participate in if you were a member of one of these big auditing firms. And so I want to highlight a little bit that there are some differences that are apt, that are relevant for algorithmic auditing. That is slightly different. Truthfully, there's not a huge difference. But the goal of an audit or assurance engagement. So here I have a quote from ISAE 3000. An insurance engagement is an engagement in which a practitioner aims to obtain sufficient appropriate evidence in order to express a conclusion designed to enhance the degree of confidence of the intended users, other than the responsible party, about the subject matter information. So in this case, the subject matter information is, it could be the requirements of the DSA, it could be whether you have a good quality management system or whether you have done appropriate bias testing. And that is the outcome of the measurement or evaluation of an underlying subject matter against criteria. So, under this sort of goal, in theory, what do you need above just sort of standard auditing practices that someone might use? And I think there are kind of three related and sort of in a tier because they sort of feed into each other. Three unique needs here for this ecosystem to work. And again, this is my opinion, and I'm very opinionated on this subject. And I'm totally open to there being other avenues and other reasonings for the sort of thing. But what I see as three unique needs here is the nature of the risks. So complexity. These are very complex systems. So what I have here on the slide is complexity can lead to risks stemming from a lack of visibility or knowledge. So if you think about an assurance or audit engagement, essentially you have to verify the claims that an organization has made. So claims like, we have tested a system for bias and this is what the results are, or we have mitigated risk, societal risk on our platform, and these are the ways in which we did it. Part of that procedure when you engage in a company to do these sorts of engagements is you have to identify risks of you getting it wrong. And lots of times there are many risks. One of the risks is fraud, is that someone is going to give you false information. And a lot of the sort of financial auditing and other kind of assurance that has to deal with that sort of thing, that's kind of a major risk. That's something that is there and you want to look out for it. There's something that's sort of been hidden intentionally or even maybe unintentionally, but they present it in a way that's not exactly right. And that's the same thing happens here. That risk is here, but there is another risk in that the complexity of the system, the way these algorithmic systems work, there is a risk of you simply not finding things. And so the company may have good intentions. They may have said or thought that they have complied, but because people in these companies may not have full visibility into everything that's going on because they are so complex, there is a chance that they just get it wrong. And so that's a huge risk. And so what that means is when you engage in one of these, you have to be able to spot that. You have to know where those risks lie. So the standard risk-based approach in terms of deciding what procedures you need to do for these audits is sort of confounded by the complexity of the situation. And so that leads on to the second bullet point here, which is subject matter uncertainty. The field itself is so new that it's evolving so fast. It has few empirically proven sort of best practices that it's very difficult to sort of land on what should be done. So there are statements about what in regulations and laws about what they're aiming for in terms of protecting people or ensuring or mitigating risk, but it's unclear what that actually entails. And this becomes even more complicated when you have the real technical things like bias assessment. In particular, the difference between so let's say I have a requirement that you need to test your system for bias along some categories. This field is such that it's very easy to produce a bias assessment that makes total sense to you, but does not actually, and looks okay on paper, looks very rigorous on paper, but there are areas of that algorithmic system that do not get probed at all and could contain a whole lot of bias. And that is something that is difficult to predict. It's difficult to manage that risk. And so there needs to be, you need to go a lot deeper when you are coming up with what procedures you need to engage in for these sorts of assessments, these sort of engagements, in order to sort of overcome that uncertainty. And then that leads finally onto the third bullet point, which is a lack of skills. There is a unique skill set here, an experience that's needed to manage these other two risks. So the difference between a person who can recognize when there is a problem, like the one I just mentioned in bias testing, or whether there is some fundamental risk in the platform, like let's say it's a platform, or some sort of algorithmic system. Maybe it's used for hiring, or maybe it's used for lending or something. There could be sort of really obvious risks that somebody who has a lot of experience in this would notice and realize that they've been missed in the statements that the organization gave to you. And the difference between that person and a person who is also highly skilled in auditing and lots of other, even data science and other areas, it's hard to tell the difference between those people. And so there's a set of skills, and there's a unique set of skills which are hard to come by. And that makes this a more difficult problem, because figuring out what are those areas that you need to have subject matter expertise in order to not just focus on the subject matter. So it's obvious that there are going to be criteria that and things that you have to check, but I'm just talking about assessing what the auditor's risk is for you missing something or there being something that is insufficient. And just at that level of assessing that risk, you need to have these skills. And then, of course, the subject matter itself, you have to understand how what they did applies to the criteria or not. Let me check my time here. So, I'm approaching time, and I think I want to take questions if I have questions. So the other thing that I was going to do is, where can you start? And so if you're asking yourself, either you're a company or you work with companies that have to comply with these sorts of things, where do you even start to think about, oh, I might be audited one day, or it might be a requirement. What do I need to set up now to prepare for that? Our rule of thumb is, you lead with ethics. So think about what's the right thing to do in these situations. Focus on risk, because risk is the major issue. And then eventually you win with trust. So I'm going to stop here. There's a whole bunch of things, and I can put these, I'll put the slides with that extra information into the attach it to the YouTube channel, or I'll post it on LinkedIn. And let me see if we have any questions. Yes, first question was about slides, and the answer is yes, I'll definitely give these slides. So this is a question you shared last week, your recommendations for AI ethics consulting businesses. Now we're building resources for ethics and training. Will be offered in Europe. Here it is. So the question is does it make sense to concentrate only on data ethics part, or algorithmic bias, or general AI ethics? So I think I think the answer here is the need for general AI ethics is becoming less. I think there are a lot more people who have general AI ethics knowledge. There's always going to be someone who needs to get up to speed with sort of the general field. And one of the slides I just clicked out of was talking about what do you need to start this process. And the very first thing you need is a broad awareness of the types of risks associated with these systems. And so that's all, you're always going to need that as a foundation. However, in terms of like differentiating yourself and really making a career out of this, focusing on some of the nitty-gritty aspects, whether that be algorithmic bias, whether that be like good governance mechanisms that organizations can use, whether that's bias testing, explainability. I think we need to go beyond that. And so in my mind, if you're thinking about a training program, then I think getting through the AI ethics stuff is a clear first requirement. But then beyond that, you're going to want to sort of find some of those really good areas that bring a lot of value, and they're specialized. And so picking one or two of those and going relatively deep with the most sort of up-to-date best practices, I think that's the way to go. Of course, my opinion. So another question about unique need or the nature of risks. For the complexity, what if we define the standards for the components of an AI system? So data, algorithm, ML part, process management, related business functions, and audit each of the components individually. So this is a good question. And in theory, this makes a lot of sense. And in fact, I mean, that's how, even in that discussion yesterday with the European Commission about the Digital Services Act, there was sort of a framing of the problem where you have different requirements, and this could be broad. This doesn't have to do with the Digital Services Act per se, but you're right, there are different requirements in different areas. It could be transparency requirements. It could be sort of technical testing or monitoring requirements. It could be governance requirements. And my feeling about this is that we should resist the temptation to separate those too much. There clearly will be some things where it has to be a multidisciplinary team. No doubt about that. But it's from our practice, it's been clear that a lot of these risks, there are risks that thread through all of those elements, all the way from how does the algorithm work, how is it presented to the user, how is it presented to a person who it's getting used on, how does that connect with the data policy, like the training data, let's say if it's a machine learning algorithm, how do issues get raised and get brought to maybe an issue response team or to management. And I feel like if we silo those, there's a real worry that, okay, we're going to have a team of lawyers in our company focusing on preparing us for the fundamental rights assessments, and another team of data scientists preparing us for the technical assessments, and another one for, let's say, user experience, that we lose that really important socio-technical thread that has to thread through all of them. And so I think that you're absolutely right. It's going to be a partitioning of this, but it has to be overseen by groups that understand how those connect in order to really make it effective, because you don't want it to be like a siloed process. Another question about from a student who's focusing on AI ethics and spirituality. Is there a coaching or some kind of association possible? Okay, absolutely. So, yeah, in general, like one of our goals, so we have two parts. We have the algorithmic bias lab, which is sort of like a division, an education and research division of BABL. When I say division, it's like kind of a fake, which gave it a name. And BABL's the consultancy, but we definitely are interested in sort of fostering more people getting into this field. So whether that's through mentoring or courses, or potentially doing, coming in on some advising or coming in on a small research project, we're always open to that. So if any students that are interested want to reach out, like depending on how busy we are, we're definitely looking for encouraging people to get into the field, because we definitely need that. Okay, and so I think that's it for questions. Thank you very much. I appreciate you coming to Lunchtime BABLing. If you have, for those of you who are listening to this on a podcast or watching us on YouTube, if you want to subscribe and like this, and if you have any comments for us and they want us to respond to, feel free to comment below. Thank you very much and have a good day.